Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Back on, please. There we go. Cameras rolling. We are going live. Welcome to TEDxKingsCross. Hello to everybody who's here in the cinema with us in King's Cross. Hello to everyone in the Everymans across the UK and to the people at home watching worldwide. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the first ever one of these events. We're absolutely thrilled. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, 12 speakers in total. We've got 2 pre-recorded and 10 here live tonight, which we're very excited about. Please do feel free to share what you hear, share your ideas, how it's going at TEDxKingsCross and using the hashtag TEDxKingsCross. Tonight's talks are just that. We can't have a panel or a Q&A, but for those of you in person here tonight, some of our speakers will be coming to the bar afterwards and you can come and meet them and us after that. We'd love to have you here. And I guess it sort of goes without saying that this has been a year that's going to be remembered. 2021 will be remembered for being a year where we talked a lot about climate change, often for the wrong reasons, but sometimes for the right. And what I think we can all say is that what's happened with the narrative around climate is that it's shifted a huge amount from how to avoid catastrophic climate change into what the solutions really are. And that's what we're going to hear about tonight. We're kicking off with a speaker who has done amazing work looking into the anthropological history of climate change and the science behind it. She runs an NGO called Possible, co-runs an NGO called Possible, I should say, and is an author in her own right. And I would like to welcome Alice Bell.
Hello. We live in extraordinary times. Extraordinary times. As citizens of the 2020s, we have inherited an almighty mess. And so I've just written a book about the history of the climate crisis and spent several years researching it. And one of the hardest bits of that research, emotionally difficult bits, was sitting there reading stuff that scientists had written in the 1960s, the 1970s, or the 1980s, where they said that if we didn't act, sometime after the year 2000, people would have to experience devastating levels of global warming. And I'm sitting there in 2020 thinking, yeah, really, yeah. And the challenge that we now face in 2021 is not that dissimilar from the challenge that we faced when I was a kid first discovering about global warming in the 1980s and the 1990s. We have to radically transform our energy and our agricultural system at a humongous rate, except that in 2021, rather than 1991, we have to do this at an almost unimaginable speed because the people before us have been dragging their heels. And we have to do all of that stuff while battling those storms and heat waves those dudes in 1965 warned us about. Now, what you might wonder, how long have we known about this then? How long have we known about this? Well, 1856. 1856 was the year that a scientist first took a tube of carbon dioxide and put it on her windowsill in the sunlight just to see what would happen. She had a tube of ordinary air next to it to compare it because she was a good scientist. Her name was Eunice Newton-Foote, and she lived in New York State. She was an amateur scientist, although that was much more usual at the time. It wasn't that weird for a woman to be doing a bit of science on her windowsill in the 1850s. And she looked at the way in which the heat had been absorbed by this tube of carbon dioxide, and she thought, it's really absorbed a lot of heat. Like, it's a lot hotter than the tube of normal air. And she noticed that it held on to that heat for a lot longer too. And she wrote up her results in a paper, because she was a good scientist, and almost in passing in her conclusion, she said, an atmosphere filled with this gas would get very, very hot indeed. And she presented this paper at a major scientific conference. It was even written up in the magazine Scientific American, although under the slightly patronising headline of Scientific Ladies. And no one paid much attention. Luckily for science, a man came along and said almost exactly the same thing a couple of years later. Ladies, we've all been here. There's a man named John Tyndall working at the Royal Institution, which is a few miles south of where we are today in Mayfair. And he did very similar experiments, and he presented that, and he presented it in front of the Prince Albert, and it was written up. He wrote a best-selling book that mentioned it. People were aware of it. They didn't suddenly go out into the streets and shout out about the dangers of global warming, because at the time it was all kind of theory. It was like, well, maybe if there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it would get hot. But people at the time were more worried about global cooling. They were worried that levels of carbon dioxide might drop, and we might have a new ice age. Although, with the advantages of modern science, we now know that the Earth was already warming because of because of carbon dioxide emissions of fossil fuel industry and because of cutting down trees, because of agriculture. We know that by the 1850s, the world was already warming under Eunice Foote's feet. But she and Tyndall had no way of knowing that themselves. To them, Tyndall had started his scientific career in the railways. He had seen the environmental impacts of ripping up the countryside to build the railways, to pump out all this coal, as well as the political and economic changes it had made. But for the Victorians, in the middle of the 19th century, the idea that that humans could have such a profound impact on the Earth to change the climate just seemed almost irreligious to even think that. So this was just theory. And it kind of got piled away and sort of filed away at the back of a scientific library until the end of that century, around the 1890s, where a group of Swedish scientists started looking again at it and running some maths on it. And the most famous of this group of Swedish scientists was a guy called Svante Arrhenius, who, for trivia fans, is actually a relative of Greta Thunberg. Her dad is named after him. Their family have been complaining about this issue for over 100 years. When I found that out, I was like, this is like a gift to historians of the climate crisis. Anyway, Svante Arrhenius and his friends in Sweden started looking at this more again, and one of them said, we are burning quite a lot of coal and oil. Do you think maybe that could be creating more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And they sort of looked into it, and they thought, all right, theoretically, we now know we were already doing this, but for them it was theory. Like, theoretically, humans could create enough carbon dioxide to warm the atmosphere, but it wouldn't happen for hundreds of years. It won't be for hundreds of years. And anyway, it'll probably be quite nice. Not long after that, there was a bit of lab research done, again in Sweden, that seemed to refute the idea that actually carbon dioxide did have an impact in the atmosphere. I mean, it's one thing on Eunice Foote's windowsill or Tyndall's lab in Mayfair, but in the wider atmosphere, it didn't seem to make sense. So they threw it away. They kind of thought, this was an interesting idea once upon a time, but it didn't have any, there was no lead to it. A bit before World War I, a few people started thinking, it's getting quite warm. If you notice, you talk to old people and they'd be like, winters aren't what they used to be. So a journalist at Popular Mechanics magazine, he started digging into the weather data, and he realised that actually there did seem to be a warming trend there. And he dug out this old work that said that maybe carbon dioxide emissions could increase the temperature, the global temperature. And he said, well, with the rate of industrialisation being what it's been, maybe this isn't something for some sci-fi future. Maybe it's already happening. And this went round a few other news articles around the world. Every now and again it goes viral. Coal causing global warming, 1912. You've probably seen it on the internet. People keep emailing it to me going, have you seen this? And I go, yes, I've seen this. But at the time, it was quite fringe science. And again, they thought it was a good thing. They were thinking, in the future generations will look back and thank us for burning all this coal. And again, it sort of trembled on us at the edge of science until the 1930s, where a guy called Guy Callender, who was actually his day job was working in fossil fuels, but his hobby was playing with maths data, with weather data, and doing some maths on it. let's not judge. I'm really into knitting. We've all got our hobbies. And he looked at the data since kind of the end of the 19th century, the weather data, and which was roughly his age, roughly the time it'd been since those Swedish scientists had started looking into it. And he realised that there'd been, in that period, global warming of about 1/3 of a degree Celsius. So to put that into context, where we are now is a bit over a degree. So it was about 1/4 of the way there in the late 30s. And he presented his paper at the Royal Meteorological Society in 1938, and they basically laughed him out of the room. People, they then agreed that the world was warming. They just didn't think it was a carbon dioxide problem. This seemed ridiculous to them. After the war, though, and then the world went to war, and they burnt even more fossil fuels, found new ways to burn fossil fuels. Callender himself worked at the Petrol Warfare Division and actually patented a special type of device that burnt thousands of gallons of oil at once to be able to clear fog so that aircraft could land. Or to put it another way, having had his work on carbon dioxide and climate change laughed out of the academy, he went to work burning as much fossil fuels as possible in order to control the weather. But after the war, there was more lab research was done, which seemed to refute that earlier work that had refuted the earlier work. And it didn't seem quite so weird. People were measuring the glaciers at the polar regions and realising how much they were shrinking, quite how fast they were melting. Callender's work didn't seem so laughable, so more scientists came back to it, including a guy called Roger Revelle, who's an oceanographer in the west coast of the States. He was very good at getting military money to fund his environmental research. And in 1956, a century after Eunice Foote's work, he worked on a paper looking at how much carbon dioxide the oceans would absorb, or rather how much the carbon dioxide the oceans weren't absorbing. And he wrote in his paper that we were conducting, with the rate of fossil fuel burning that was going on, humans were conducting a vast geophysical experiment on the Earth. And he went to Congress and he warned them, he used the same phrase, warn them, and said that they needed to fund more climate science. And Revelle himself, at the first, wasn't super scared by this. He quite liked geophysical experiments. He was a scientist. He thought nuclear would come in and solve all our problems. But he gradually got more and more sort of worried about this. And the first international conference on climate change happened in 1963. And there, geophysicists like Revelle were joined by ecologists, and they could bring with them a little bit more, a slightly different approach to, or different attitude to technology and nature, and a slightly more kind of concerned approach to environmental risk as well. And we've been having international conferences on climate change ever since 1963, ever more fearful ones, with more and more data as more and more climate science comes up. We've learnt to fear other greenhouse gases like methane, not just carbon dioxide. We've got greater and greater evidence. We've also got loads of solutions. We've got incredible things like solar or wind, which it is kind of amazing that we have. And you have to read my book to hear the story about that. It's a plug. It's called Our Biggest Experiment, out in all good bookshops now. And the last of these big conferences we've just wrapped up in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago. And I wrote this book, I was sort of reading all these people talking about, if only we'd acted in 1960. And I think, oh God, if only we've acted in 1960. And in many ways, it was a very depressing experience writing it. But also, I ended feeling quite hopeful because as well as all of those terrible sort of years of delay, we've also got a lot of opportunities. We've been left technologies like solar and wind. We've been left organisations like the UNFCCC. We have events like this. We have phrases like climate crisis to help us talk about it. And most of all, we have that climate science. We have that warning that it's happening. Because even with the ways in which climate change has been hitting us with ever more devastating impacts the last few years, it's not obvious that it's greenhouse gases that are causing the problem. We could all too easily be sitting here thinking the weather's a bit weird again. And we're not. We're forewarned. We've got solutions. We've got warning. We've got the knowledge. And we should hold that tight. Because I think whether you personally discovered climate change in the mid-1950s, the mid-1990s, or the middle of last week, it is not too late for all of us to do everything that we can and grasp all of the opportunities that we have been left. And we owe that, not just to the future, the people who come to the earth in the future generations who will inherit whatever we leave on this earth. We owe that to the people who've come before us as well, people like Foote and Callender, who've left us something to work with. So let's make 2020s extraordinary times. Let's make them extraordinary for good reasons. Let's seize all those opportunities we've been left.
Thank you, Alice. I feel like I've been on a speed date with every climate scientist there ever was. Absolutely brilliant framing, and what a good setup for the evening. Next up, we've got somebody who used to be an optimist, and I'll let him explain a bit more about that. Please welcome Ed Gillespie.
Elegantly done. I'm not a solutionist. I'm going to stick my naughty fly in the well-intentioned, beautiful ointment of this evening and say I'm not a solutionist. And actually talking about fixing and solving climate change, I think, is part of the problem. You can try and fix your bike, or you can solve a crossword. Climate change is a bit more complicated than that. Because climate change is not like the ozone layer. It's not caused by one thing in one place which can be easily fixed by one international protocol. It's not a war, because we're all on multiple sides at the same time. And if it's a war on ourselves. And it's not like an asteroid coming at us from outer space like some terrible, unforeseen accident. It's something which has a deep history, has vested interests, and a grim predictability. Because climate change is not a problem to be fixed or solved. It's a predicament. It's something we're going to have to work our way through. And it's also not like previous active social movements. It's not like civil rights or the suffragettes, where actually that was about the self-liberation of oppressed groups. Because climate change requires us to be selfless, and it requires us to care and connect for other lives, both human and non-human, who are often voiceless and cannot defend themselves. Because climate change is not an inconvenient glitch in the system. It's actually a symptom of something which has gone very profoundly wrong in our sense of relationship, which is a worldview of atomization, individualism, extractivism, industrialism, colonialism, and exploitation, of power over one another and power over nature. And that is a profound failure of relationship, both with ourselves and with the wider planet. And I would say it's an abusive relationship. And we need to look at ourselves in the mirror. As my future colleague Mark Stevenson says, depending on what we see in that reflection, is it narcissus, a chronic self-love, or is it catharsis, something where we are confronted with our own responsibilities and galvanized into action? And many of you might have done a sort of deep eye contact exercise with another person where you stare into each other's eyes for 3 or 4 minutes. And that's an incredibly powerful experience. And what I would urge us all to do is to do what Joanna Macy says. Hold the gaze. Hold the gaze. Like Greta Thunberg with her autistic spectrum gifts, we cannot look away from this challenge. And we have to look at it very honestly. Because if not, we're just gaslighting ourselves. Because right now there is a huge honesty gap. You know, you will hear your political leaders talking about the sunlit uplands of painless transitions without a hair shirt in sight. But to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and let's face it, it's pretty much in desperate resuscitation right now, we still have a hypothetical chance of getting there, but politically and technically, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So I think we're going to live through this era. You know, we're not going to fix or solve climate change. We're going to have to transformatively adapt to it. It's going to be an intergenerational challenge that our children, our grandchildren, and probably our great-grandchildren will have to engage with. And that requires us to think about the biggest we, not just ourselves as individuals with our own behaviour changes, but also pulling at every systemic lever we have at our disposal at the same time. Because when you actually engage with this challenge, as I have for over half my working life, 25 years now, it's normal to feel a whole suite of emotions: rage, anger, guilt, despair, frustration, anxiety, and grief. And that's all normal. But what we mustn't do is deploy our own psychological defenses to engage in a form of psychic numbing, because everyone projects onto climate change. It's such a big issue. On one side, you have the projected hope, the techno-utopian optimists with their messianic fervour who will tell you that just one more push of that brittle one-dimensional optimism will get us over the line. On the other side, you have the projected hopelessness, the resigned fatalism and nihilism, the misanthropy. But those are two opposing cliffs of projection. And in the middle, balancing on a precarious tightrope is where we have to balance, with a bit of humour, humility, and hyper self-reflectivity to keep asking ourselves the most difficult of questions, because the weather inside, how we handle our own emotional reactions to this, is going to be absolutely critical as things get both better and worse at the same time in the coming years. Because you don't fix or solve a broken relationship. You reinvent it, you reimagine it, you refresh it, you revitalize it. You put the life back into it. You literally breathe the life back into a relationship. Because solutions in that sense are just a distraction. It's a bit like saying to the lone woman on the streets of London late at night when approached by a single police officer that she should flag down a bus. It's a bit like putting cut lids on drinks in nightclubs to prevent spiking. They are tactics which are masking a toxic cultural problem underneath. And if we don't start asking the right questions, then we will end up with things like electric vehicles clogging our streets in the same way that cars do now, and we'll just have clean, quiet traffic jams. Because our breathless impatience on this, which is understandable, tells us that we don't have time for moral awakenings or moral imaginings. And we rush headlong towards these low-carbon technical solutions. But without those moral awakenings and moral imaginings, we're just going to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And that's what leads to this edge of space willy waving that's going on at the moment, where we look to Mars with one covetous, flirtatious wink, like serial planetary monogamists, having dumped a broken relationship here back on Earth. And I think we need to use the most powerful human emotion, which is shame. And shame is a really difficult emotion. We are all incredibly hardwired to reject and avoid shame because it's painful. But without the shame, in the absence of shame, I think it's insulting in the context of everything we have already lost, are losing, and will lose. But perhaps most importantly, engaging with that shame might help us to transcend and be genuinely proud of what we do next together. Because the planet, our gorgeous planet, doesn't want to be fixed. It doesn't want to be solved. It doesn't want to be saved. It doesn't want to be changed even. It wants to be loved. And when we truly love something and love ourselves, then we will do everything in our power and abilities and capacities to protect, nurture, and nourish it. Because I feel that fixing and solving are the foot soldiers of certainty and authoritarianism, that are a dark cloud over a sort of resurgent populist nationalism that could impose things on us because they are justified in supposedly needing to be done. What we need is the magic of the not yet imaginable. That's where the real power lies, because great relationships involve listening and reflecting, challenging and confronting, but also healing together. This is an extraordinary ecological and climate emergency, and it requires us to invoke an extraordinary emergence in ourselves, to rediscover that relationship of interdependence and interconnectedness of one people amongst an indivisible, inextricable family of life on one beautiful, only, lonely planet. And that is the relationship that must be restored. Because if we can embrace that relationship in these very difficult and uncertain times, then the path that is as yet untrodden may yet appear beneath our feet. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ed. That was so powerful, and even though we've rehearsed it and I've heard some of it before, it really reminded me how important it is that we work together. Next up, we have a brilliant talk from Tamsin Omand, who pre-recorded their talk last week here on the stage. They're unable to be with us this evening, but watching from Ullapool, and possibly the most northerly live stream that we've got of the event. So, hi Tamsin, and we'll go over to your VT now.
Hello. Before I begin, I want to lift up the wisdom of Indigenous people who show us a world that is alive and sacred. How we might begin to learn from and honour their perspective is everything that I hope my life can circle around and get closer to. But my life was forged in London, the epicentre of some pretty dominant stories about how we should organise the world. Stories that in some ways are the antithesis to the woven threads of Indigenous wisdom. Stories that see London as home to extraction and hierarchy. The Industrial Revolution, capitalism, colonialism, the slave trade, white supremacy, patriarchy. That is a lot of systemic injustice baked into my geography and into the context that made me. I'm Tamsin, a 37-year-old white, non-binary trans person who, for the past 16 years, has been relentlessly involved in the environmental movement. Now, for the first 10 years of that journey, I approached climate as though it was somehow separate to me, like it was a problem that could be beat. If I could just campaign and change a particular piece of legislation or provoke a public conversation about a specific aspect of our carbon-intensive lifestyles, then maybe, just maybe, global temperatures would peak, would begin to come down, and we could all just carry on as normal. But what is normal? A normal where rich nations hoard COVID vaccines and spend 2.3 times more militarizing our borders than we do on helping those countries who have contributed least to climate change and are devastated right now by its impacts. A normal where we are valued by the profit we produce rather than by the courage and kindness of our hearts. The climate and ecological emergency is not a problem to be solved. It is our context now, shaped by us and by over 400 years of white Western dominance. It is a symptom of injustice, racial, economic, gender, intergenerational, all rooted in the exploitation of the many to give enormous wealth and power to a very small few. The climate emergency is proof, if we needed it, that there is something broken in our relationships with each other, with ourselves, and with our planet. Audre Lorde taught us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. This climate emergency, this context we created, it isn't something any of us can beat or escape. Our aching planet is inviting us to stop, to examine the power-hungry forces in our lives and our cultures, and to transform so that we might heal our relationship with the planet, yes, and with each other. We have dominated nature, forcing it to provide our every consumer want. Instead of care and respect, we have extracted. And even at this point of environmental crisis, we show few signs of slowing down. Instead, we have pushed ourselves and our planet, ignoring our natural limits because our culture tells us that without pushing, without consuming, without striving and endlessly doing, we are not enough. I want to rip that idea out from me and out from so many people who I love. That being myself is somehow not enough. Instead, I want to prioritize the things in my life which give me meaning, connection, belonging, purpose, joy. And to do this, I need to turn quickly away from the myth of individual success and towards the truth of collective resilience. Now, I am a millennial, a child of the individualist myth. I know what it is to have an appetite that cannot be satisfied, or to feel that my life is a competition, that the things I want are scarce, and that to get them, it is me versus you. I've been dissatisfied with where I am, hungry to get somewhere else, exhausting myself getting there, and then disappointed when I've discovered that the place, position, goal, ambition that I had fought so hard to get didn't fill me up after all. It is hard to untangle ourselves from the idea that only through accumulating can we be happy. It is hard to trust that purpose, joy, belonging can be enough. But I have been alongside people and created experiences that have shown me time and again that nothing worth doing is done alone. From stepping out onto the roofs of Parliament and dropping banners against the third runway at Heathrow, to walking out into the road alongside Greta Thunberg on the first day of Extinction Rebellion, these things happened because we gathered a community, identified a shared vision, and then did the slow and sturdy work, organising our community into a force that could deliver that vision, petition by petition, fundraiser towards a fundraising goal, through conflict, communicating until we reached a resolution, setting our boundaries, having those boundaries trampled all over and then reasserting them, campaigning with effort and focus until we won, and then celebrating those victories. These shared experiences, at whatever scale, bind us to one another and to the vision that we co-create. The climate and ecological emergency is our reality now. We can't escape it, so instead we have to decide who will we be in the midst of it, and who will we stand alongside. Building community isn't easy, especially in a world where algorithms reward us with dopamine hits the more antagonistic we are. But love, patience, tolerance, these are the only building blocks we have to thrive through coming storms. We can see that when disaster hits, the best of our humanity can leap to the rescue. Whether it's the community organising that brought food and water to the most vulnerable following Hurricane Sandy, or the tens of thousands of self-organised mutual aid groups that grew up and supported people throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. We can build vibrant and resilient communities when we are on the knife edge of disaster. Our challenge is to build those communities now, build that resilience into our lives now, rather than crossing our fingers and hoping that it will emerge when disaster strikes, because it is only through the communities we form and the ways we find to work together that we will change the world and be changed too. Now, exactly 1 month ago, I had a double mastectomy as part of my transition. As I mentioned, I'm trans, non-binary, and this was gender-affirming healthcare. Explaining that would probably need to be a whole other TED talk, and to be honest, there are people more confident than me talking about their experience of being trans, but it is important to say now, because whilst I've been recovering, feeling more fragile than I have ever felt before. I understood that I am held by all the relationships that my life is embedded within. As I circle more closely to the me I've always been but didn't know how or feel safe to show, I am strengthened by the courage of trans people who came before me and who lived and died with no idea how their example of living was carving out space for me. Our relationships don't just exist in the present, they reach back through history and forwards to the world that has not yet begun. My trans ancestors, trans elders in my community imagined this world where I can stand here proudly. They made it possible for me. We can imagine a world free from injustice, and through our relationships with people in the past who made the world this way, with people in the present who are ready to be part of our community, and with every single life that follows ours, we can make good things happen. We can transform the world. Within your life, your family, your friends, your community, your career, you already know what more you can do to respond to the climate emergency. Now, you need to find your people who will hold you to account and encourage you to do it. Because no one person is going to save the day. The world is too massive and complex for that. Instead, the invitation is there for us to build our communities so that we can become the people who 7 generations from now will be remembered gratefully. Thank you.
I watched that recording and I watched it today, having already seen it before, and was trying to hold on to some pithy statement to kind of pull it all together at the end, and then every time I held on to something there was just another piece, and between all the tears and everything else. That was amazing, Tamsin. I hope you're recovering well and enjoying the evening. Our next speaker is someone whose story I've been following since I entered the climate movement. Someone whose story is fascinating and inspiring, and who shows us that we can all do something really positive if we've got a bit of courage. Catherine Howarth.
If we want to put a halt to climate change, we've got to follow the money. The big high carbon companies spewing out emissions and causing all the issues, coal, oil, gas, chemicals, cement, aviation, every one of these sectors depends from day to day utterly on banking services and on insurance. And from year to year, they depend for support for their business strategies on big institutional investors that own their shares and get to vote at their annual general meetings on who sits on the boards. Those investors are our pension funds. The truth is that the high carbon industries and the high carbon companies of the world cannot move a muscle without the support of financial institutions that all of us are very familiar with. If you have a bank account, if you have any savings in a pension fund, if you have money with a fund manager, then you have a very real stake in this. And that stake gives you more power than you might have thought to help fix the climate emergency. But we do need to activate our money. Coming up for 20 years ago, I stumbled across the well-kept secret that you don't need to be wealthy to mobilise your money and use the power of finance to create positive change in the world. It started for me when I began work as a community organiser in the East End of London, and I was tasked with helping to launch and develop the Living Wage campaign. The national minimum wage is not enough to live on, never has been, especially in London. We wanted living wages. With a big, shapeless problem like poverty pay or climate change, you've got to break that problem down into manageable bits. And 20 years ago for us in East London, that looked like picking off contract cleaning. All the big banks in Canary Wharf and the financial companies, but also all the hospitals in East London, all awarded big contracts for cleaning. And the people that worked on those contracts were on rock bottom wages. And my job in the first months of our campaign involved sneaking into the broom cupboards of the hospitals across East London and during the day, and then in the evening, heading down to Canary Wharf to find the hidden service entrances where I met with dozens and dozens of cleaners and listened to their stories and began to figure out how would we break down this problem and begin to make headway with this campaign. One evening, I was introduced to Abdul Durant in the basement of the Canary Wharf main tower. Abdul was propped up against a ginormous bin, 2 metres wide and 2 metres tall, and he'd been working night shifts as a cleaner for many years. He was very much up for a chat. In fact, Abdul was very much up for some action. At that time, HSBC Bank was just completing construction of an enormous new world headquarters at Canary Wharf. And right next door, Barclays Bank, their old rival in the British banking establishment, was building another tower. Approaching these banks and engaging them as targets of our campaign was an obvious next step. And so we reached out first to HSBC and asked them if they would consider writing living wage standards into the contract they were about to award for their new world headquarters. The chairman of the bank was very clear on the matter. No, he said, it's for the market to decide. We will not interfere in the matter of these wages. Well, at that time, as of today, still today, it was very easy to purchase a few shares in each of the banks with an eye to attending their annual general meetings and putting the question further to the whole board of both companies. Abdul had just been assigned to work on the contract at the new tower, HSBC's new tower. So it was obvious that he would be the right person to put the question at their AGM. And going to Barclays fell to me. This was a very daunting proposition. The annual general meetings of large banks are huge affairs with hundreds of shareholders, and the boards sit up on a big stage and glare down at all the shareholders beneath. You do not want to fluff up your question. But to their credit, the directors of Barclays were actually quite gracious when I suggested that they consider writing living wage standards and ensuring that everyone working in their new headquarters would be paid the living wage. They didn't dismiss it out of hand, as HSBC had done, but agreed to take it away, consider it, and talk it over with us. 3 weeks later, at HSBC's AGM, Abdul Durant caused a huge stir with his question. For a start, it was absolutely unheard of for a cleaner not just to be seen, but to be heard at the annual general meeting of one of Britain's biggest companies. And he asked and made a request, made the case for living wages with such quiet dignity. The following day, the story was all over the business pages of the British press. We had put the issue on the map. Some 8 months or so later, no doubt with an eye to stealing a march on their big rival in banking, Barclays announced that they would be the first big company in this country to write living wage standards into their service contracts. A huge win for our campaign. It was very widely publicised, and not long later, HSBC decided to follow suit. For all that bluff about the market must decide, it turned out that the directors of HSBC could very much make their own decision to do the right thing. What that experience proved to me was the extraordinary potential and power of mobilising our money to create positive change in the world. And 20 years on, I still own the shares that I bought in those companies to help support the living wage campaign. And lately, those shares have been coming in very handy all over again. In fact, my 5 shares in HSBC have been a very sound investment. The banks of the world are utterly critical to the climate outcomes we now need. Banks must stop financing the fossil fuel industries, particularly for expansion of new coal, oil and gas. And at the same time, banks must make conditional the financing and loans they provide to sectors like chemicals and cement and steel, that as a condition of finance, those companies in those sectors must produce detailed and rigorous plans showing how they will bring down their emissions year on year. As we know, we're in a catastrophic climate situation if we don't shrink emissions globally by about 7% a year for the whole of this decade. It's an unbelievably daunting prospect, but it's what the science demands, and banks have an utterly central role to play in making it happen. Earlier this year, the organisation I now work for, Share Action, pulled together a coalition of 130 shareholders in HSBC to put a bold proposition to the bank. We coordinated the filing of a shareholder resolution which called on HSBC to cease financing the global coal sector. To file a shareholder resolution in the UK, you need to have a minimum of 100 shareholders involved. Most of the shareholders in our coalition owned just a single share in HSBC. A single share in HSBC costs £4.15. Most people had come together, they'd gone out to buy a share so that they could help us get over that critical threshold of 100 shareholders. But in our coalition included were some of the biggest pension funds in the UK and Europe's largest fund manager. Over the years, as we've grown and developed this movement, we've got more and more real power on board. So how did HSBC respond? Well, they have committed to phase out all financing of the global coal sector in the rich countries of the world by 2030 and in the rest of the world by 2040. Is it enough? Is it everything we want? No, not yet, but it is a fantastic start. It's a big step up for HSBC and it's testimony to the power of this form of action. So what would accelerate the change we need? How do we ensure that the global finance industry takes climate change seriously? Well, for one thing, if you haven't already, it's time to let the companies looking after your money know that this matters to you. Get on the phone or send an email to your bank and make sure you know how they compare with the other banks when it comes to the financing of high carbon industries. Share Action can help you with that. Band together with other people in your place of work who share the same outlook as you do on climate change. You'll be in the same workplace pension scheme, and together you're much stronger in making the case to the people that look after your money on your behalf that they should put climate considerations front and centre. What Abdul showed with his question all those years ago was the startling effect of finding your voice and expressing your values in the corridors of financial power. You can do it too. In fact, we need your support. It's time to activate your money.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we could all be a bit more Abdul, and maybe just a bit more Catherine. Our next speaker takes us from finance over to tech. I'm really excited about this talk, and I'd like you to all put your hands together for Matt Britton.
Thank you very much. Hello. It's a real privilege to be alongside these speakers and talking about the most important issue of our time, which is the climate crisis, and the responsibility and the opportunity that we have to rise to that challenge and to meet the moment. And for those of us lucky enough to be here today, we can actually make a difference and do something positive in this crisis. And we need to, because those who are going to be most impacted by the crisis are those who've done the least to contribute to it. Half the planet, the poorest half of the planet, are responsible for less than 10% of emissions. And many of those people are people living in under hostility, oppression, conflict, who are dealing with racism, sexism, and poverty. Those are the people most impacted. In fact, it's predicted that between 2030 and 2050, 250,000 people a year will die because of climate change-related consequences and causes. 250,000 people a year. So those of us with the opportunity have to rise to the challenge and meet that moment. It has to change, and it has to change now. But I want to give you a sense as to why I, with a background in business and technology, have some optimism that we can meet that challenge, particularly if the responsibility that business has to shoulder more of the work is embraced. The opportunity that technology brings to address the challenges with speed and scale can be embraced. And the imperative that countries and companies and communities work together is adopted. I'm going to talk about each of those things, if I may. We start with business. Business needs to shoulder more of the work. If every business leader lets go of the notion that what's good for the planet is bad for business and realizes that good business is doing the right thing, we can make a difference. And the good news is, as we've just heard, your customers want it, your employees demand it, and increasingly your shareholders require it. People are voting with their feet when it comes to sustainable choices. And if you look at customers of business, what do we know? Well, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys people in many countries at scale all around the world, tells us that over 70% of people around the world are fearful of or concerned about climate change. In Europe, when you look at what voters in Europe say, the top thing they're concerned about, the first major threat is not coronavirus, it's the climate crisis. And if I look at Google, we can see that over the last 5 years, searches for sustainable goods and products have gone up by 5 times. So people are voting with their feet. If you look at employees, McKinsey did a survey of businesses and business leaders and asked them, what are the reasons for making positive change in your business towards sustainability? The purpose of the business, customers, but right up there are employees. And then we've just heard about this, the shareholder agenda. Increasingly, ESG, environment, social and governance changes are being pressed for by institutional investors. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Glasgow, where the UN, under Mark Carney, had assembled $130 trillion of money to push for sustainable green transition. So there's an opportunity there across customers, employees, and shareholders to drive for change in business. The question is no longer whether to do something, it's how quickly. I want to take you back for a moment, if I can. Anybody remember the days of Club Penguin and Pop Idol? Yeah? 2007. And that was the year that I started work at Google. First time I went through the doors as an employee of Google. And it was the year that we became the first major company to become carbon neutral. And those were the best tools we had at our hands in those days, but they're not good enough. It's not good enough to be carbon neutral. Offsetting is not a sustainable option. So we pretty quickly started our work to decarbonize, investing massively in renewables. We spent billions over the subsequent years on renewable energy, and our decarbonisation journey continues. But in 10 years, by 2017, we'd reached the point where we were matching all of our electricity supply with renewable energy. And we become one of the world's biggest corporate purchasers of renewable energy. And not only that, we'd found that renewable energy was actually cheaper than coal, something that when I started in 2007, we didn't believe could be possible. So it's cheaper as an option, and it's something that's accessible. So if you're running a business and you don't know where to start with climate, look at your electricity supplier. And so that's 2017, 10 years into this journey, but that's not enough. And we've set ourselves an ambitious goal that by 2030, every Gmail you send, every time you search, every video you watch on YouTube, every time you use Google Cloud, should be completely carbon-free. And we're about 2/3 of the way towards that. We don't actually know how to get fully there, but we've already got several data centers that over 90% of the time are running on carbon-free energy. And we know that the ambitious goal is the important thing. That's forced us to innovate. It's also making us work with all of our suppliers and our supply chain and many other companies to try to make the journey too. So businesses need to shoulder more of the work in this journey. Then technology. Well, technology has the opportunity to play a big role at speed and at scale. Now, the IPCC recently reported that, in fact, we've already got the technology we need. We've already got the data that we need. We just need to put it to work. I'm going to give you some examples from the work I've seen of how cities and communities and companies and consumers and citizens can put those tools to work for good. Let's start right here in London, speaking to you from King's Cross. We worked with the Mayor of London and his office to investigate the causes of air quality and emissions in the city and identify ways to reduce them. We've worked together to help to extend the ultra-low emissions zone using Google Maps and other data to explain and expand the ultra-low emissions zone. In Berlin, we're working with the city there on traffic and noise and pollution reduction. In Kampala, we're working with the university to install sensors on buildings and on taxis to understand air quality. And across over 200 cities that we've been working with, we've identified a huge range of insights that can help many other cities. We're now making that data available to 20,000 more cities around the world. And you find insights like air quality can vary by 8 times between streets that are pretty close together. So there's lots to do with cities, with data to help them understand. And we've got a tool that helps cities to see aerial photographs, can identify, for example, roofs that are suitable for solar. Many, many more tools that we and others can bring to the party. But it's not enough. We also need to look at communities and go to the other end of the spectrum, the Tembe people in the Amazon. Now, they have for years walked their forests to try to stop deforestation. It's dangerous, and it's hardly possible to cover the enormous territory. Working together, we used old mobile phones, open source technology, to put the phones on trees. And now the trees can listen to the forest. And they can listen and hear the sound of a chainsaw a kilometre away. Machine learning can identify that and tell the rangers and the community and the chief what's going on, and they can take some action. That's a way of addressing that kind of issue using simple and affordable technology. What about companies? We recently launched something for the fashion industry to help people who are making fashion, ordering and designing fashion to make more sustainable choices. This was in conjunction with Stella McCartney, who's really passionate about this area, and the WWF. So there's a tool which now exists that can look at any fibre and identify its impact: air, water, gas, forestry, biodiversity impact, and connect you with suppliers who can help you make more sustainable choices. And what about consumers? What about you and me? Well, of course, we're the people who drive all these businesses to make this stuff, right? So what can we do? Well, at Google, we can see that people use our tools sometimes to make those choices, and we want to try to provide better information to people. So if you've searched for a flight recently, if anybody's had the chance to fly anywhere, you'll see that not only are we providing details of airlines and timings and prices, but for the first time we're showing emissions data, whether the flight you're about to select has higher or lower than average emissions data based on European Environment Agency data, helping consumers to have the data that they need. Or what about Google Maps? Well, it's great for identifying walking routes. Perhaps you used it to get to where you are tonight. Where to find bicycles. But sometimes you might need to take a car journey. And if you do, we're moving to show you the most carbon minimizing option of route that's available by default. And if the gap in time between that and the next route is too big, we'll show you the time so that you can make an informed decision, and hopefully that will make a difference. In fact, we've estimated that that change alone could lead to 1 million tonnes of carbon being removed, the equivalent of 200,000 cars being taken off the road. So those are some of the tools that we can bring to consumers. I talked about cities, communities, companies, and consumers or citizens, and using technology for good to make a difference to the planet. So we put those together. I think we can see some reasons that we can rise together to the challenge, but it's also clear to me that governments need to set the targets. We saw that at COP, and they need to set the policy frameworks. But if countries and companies and communities work together, we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I can't even do the filler bit without this in front of me. So I'm going to yank it back. Oh, there we go. I really love the idea of the trees listening. I thought that was fantastic. I love the Tembe example. Thank you, Matt. So from tech to justice, our next speaker is somebody who's inspired me for so many years, but specifically this year I've loved watching her, and who's done some amazing work over the last few months, in fact, at TED Countdown and at COP26. Please put your hands together for Farhana Yamin.
Okay, so my 10 minutes, I'm going to train you to be climate Jedis. Yeah, so it's a speed training. Climate solutions need justice at their heart. And that's the big thing that we've understood much more clearly, including in Glasgow. And we're very good at making climate into a big problem. You know, I've been involved in climate negotiations since 1991, and we love acronyms. And we've got a new one now, and I think it's the best one and the one that we were missing. And it's JEDI, and it's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that's why we all must be climate Jedis, and we must put climate justice at the heart of climate solutions. I think in your training, which is what this 10 minutes is about, just remember a few key points. Forget talking about the future. Look at the past. The past is what determines and drives and locks in the future. From every present moment onwards, you lock in a pathway. And it is the past which has been very uncomfortable for us to deal with. Many of the speakers have emphasized how we've got to the climate and ecological crisis really as a result of 400 years of doing things very badly. 400 years of thinking that nature and people could be used, exploited. 400 years of colonialism, 400 years of imperialism, 400 years where we have ignored the rights of indigenous people who had a healthier relationship with nature, who did not believe in land ownership. So forget about the climate models that keep predicting and telling you to look into the future as if the injustice is based in the future. It's based in the past, and the wounds and the legacies and the systemic problems that we're facing now stem from ignoring all of those things. So principle number one, look at the past, not just the future. Forget about emissions. Look at injustice. Look at injustice in the everyday and now. The emissions are just a symptom. They're an aspect of essentially wealth and class and racial differences and discrimination. So developing and developing countries, well, the US, based on historic emissions, represents 20% of the global emissions from 1850 to 2020. You know where China is? It's nowhere near. It's 11%. If you take all the past emissions into account, Brazil, India come much lower. Russia, in fact, is the third highest emitter. The UK is 4%, I think, or 3%. Germany is 4%. So injustice is a much more accurate and helpful way to look at climate change than just focusing on emissions alone. Finally, look at the high street. Don't just keep looking at the COPs. it's odd for me to say this because I've been to 24 of them and spent all my time, but trust me, I now think that was a mistake to focus so heavily on the machinery of international governance, on national policy making, on summits, instead of what your high street looked like. And in the meantime, you know, we have neglected what's going on our doorstep. So look at the high street. Okay, Jedis, we've only got 6 minutes left. So another 5 Fs that I think help orientate you in the world and make you into a model warrior. I don't mind using that analogy. I come from a family. My dad was an armaments engineer, so we're okay. We're good with fighting the empire. And frankly, this is an epic battle between those who are fighting for the good for all of us and those polluting elites and vested interests that I have known for a very long time, since 100+ years. I'm looking at Alice and the scientists who, including myself, have now issued, you know, the 6th IPCC report saying code red. So this is really quite an epic battle. So the 5 Fs. Okay, food. Food waste, enormous problem, enormous numbers of emission, enormous numbers of harm, enormous amounts of deforestation locked in. Do something about it. Look at the injustices in the food system. Fashion, we've already had an alert. Fashion is the largest emitter. It's almost as large, the same emissions as Russia. We all get dressed in the morning, so that's something that you can do. I went on a fashion fast for a couple of years. You can turn into, you know, sustainable fashion is a fantastic thing, recycling, upcycling. I'm wearing this suit. This is from Paris. And I have to wear it with a jacket because the seams are ripped. But I can wear it. It still looks nice unless I reveal that to you. Fuel, the 3rd F, fuel. Okay, cars, transport. Again, a very heavy imprint by the wealthiest, by the 1% and the 10% who have car ownership, who have aviation, who, you know, have a lot of energy uses through properties. Fuel. Finance, you already heard that. You pay taxes. We all pay taxes, hopefully. And those taxes, your local authority, where you bank, are all ways in which you can make your money work better. And we need to divest away from the dirty old economy into the new economy. In the UK, we're still paying 14 billion a year to the oil and gas industry in the UK. We're also the 2nd largest emitter of oil and gas. So again, a little bit of, you know, remembering who's doing what. And finally, after finance, the 4th F, friendship and family. This is a very long-term battle. It's a battle which is, you know, tiring, where we all need to sustain ourselves. It's not just, you know, a COP here and a COP there. This is requires a lot of us to come together as a community. So that's why, as trainee climate Jedi warriors, you know, you need to make sure you have your community, your friends, your family, and take them with you on this very long journey to a more just world. I think I want to stress at Glasgow what the positive things were. And the positive things were this immense understanding on the behalf of the largest number of participants who attended a COP. Actually, we still had 40,000 people registered at this COP, which is bigger than any other. And there was an immense understanding that actually we are resetting our relationship with nature. We are resetting our relationship with each other. We are on a pathway to uniting many different movements. The movements by workers to demand a just transition, the movement by the gender community to demand equality and dignity for women and for girls who do still the most amount of unpaid labour in the world, the move to demand racial justice, because we know that actually climate impacts will disproportionately impact black and brown people all over the world, whether they're in the UK or in the US or in Europe or in the rest of the world. It is black and brown bodies that will suffer the impacts, that are already suffering the impacts the most. And those groups, those constituencies really came together and joined hand in hand together, and that was really, really energizing. It's very hard to convey that to people. It's very hard to convey to people why the COP was utterly depressing, but also really joyous and uplifting, and was well worth the effort of going. And I see this as a massive turning point. And that's why I'm asking each and every one of you to become a Jedi, become a champion for justice, for equity, for diversity and inclusion, to make sure that everybody is part of this effort now. This isn't an effort that's going to be solved by the scientists. I think we need more storytellers than scientists. We need to make sure that every single sector, every single school, every hospital, every workplace now understands that they have a part to play in uprooting the system, as the young people in Glasgow called it, uproot the system. And actually the system is really decaying, and it's really out of date, it's really out of order, and it needs to be replaced. And I hope very much that this 10 minutes of intensive training will help convince you that this problem is a problem, but it is one that can be fixed, as we know that the solutions are to hand, and they're cheaper and better to provide. They provide us with better jobs, clean air, warmer homes, and a more humane and kinder and nature-loving society. So it's well worth making the effort to go out and get your lightsaber and get trained up. And we need to have a lot more fun doing climate change as well. So yeah, please join us.
Before you go, thank you, Fahana. I definitely want to be a Jedi, and will remember the 3 rules and the 5 Fs. Very, very catchy. Before you go off and have a quick drink, we've got 10-minute intervals, so you can go and stretch your legs, use the bathroom, get drinks. There are 3 jobs I'd like you to do whilst you're on your breaks, if possible. First up, inside your booklets, you've all got one of these programs. There is a page which has a My Energy electric vehicle charger on it. My Energy are giving one away tonight, and if you Every time I hear him talk, it's like listening to a whole semester of education in usually an hour, but today, let's say 10 minutes. Please welcome Professor Mark Maslin.
So, welcome to the Anthropocene, a period of geological time defined by the impacts of humanity. As humans have a far greater impact on our planet than most of us realise. In many ways, we've become a geological superpower. And I'm going to give you some examples because I feel that as a scientist, as a communicator, these are facts that people need to know. We move more earth, soil and sediment than all the natural processes put together as we start to destroy our beautiful planet. We have made enough concrete to cover the whole world in a layer 2 millimeters thick, and that does include the oceans. We have made 300 million tons of plastic every single year that end up in our oceans, in our fish, and even in our own blood. There's a plastic bag that was found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 7 kilometers deep in the Northwest Pacific. The only shame is it did not have Walmart or Tesco's on it. There are now more non-recyclable Lego minifigures in the world than human beings, and there's 7.9 billion of us. Actually, I think most of them are at my house. We have cut down 3 trillion trees. That's half the trees on the planet. We use 25% of all land for our agriculture and our settlements. And probably the most stunning fact that always shocks me whenever I give it. If we take the weight of land mammals, 30% is us humans. There's a lot of us, and some of us are overweight. There's also 67% is our livestock and our pets. Just 3% are those beautiful animals that, of course, David Attenborough films for us to enjoy on our sofa on a Sunday night. Just 3%. We're also changing the climate. Greenhouse gases are now higher than they have been for the last 3 million years. Global temperatures have already risen by 1.2 degrees, and we're seeing the impacts all around the world. Severe heat waves, droughts, wildfires, floods, and storms, all compounded by the relentless rise in sea level. So, welcome to the Anthropocene, the geological period of Earth history caused by humanity. But hang on a minute. Not everybody is guilty of this rape of our beautiful planet. I'll give you an example. 50% of the lifestyle carbon emissions are generated by just the 10% richest in our global society, while the poorest 50% generate less than 10% of those emissions. It's even worse if we think about money. There are, let me do it, 9 billionaires that own the same wealth as the bottom 3.9 billion people. Half the world. I'll repeat that. Just 9 people. 825 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night in a world that produces enough food for 10 billion people. There's only 7.9 billion of us. 1 in 10 people survive on less than $2 a day. Excessive consumption is killing our planet. But maybe there's some good news. World leaders have pledged to keep global temperatures to significantly below 2 degrees and to only 1.5 degrees if possible. But to do this, we will need to be net zero by 2050, and we will have to have reduced our emissions by 50% in 9 years' time. If we do not deal with climate change, the hard-nosed economists predict it will cost us a large amount. And guess what? You can already hear the fossil fuel lobbyists and the climate change deniers whispering in your ear going, it's too expensive to go net zero. It's too expensive to save the planet. So what do those hard-nosed economists say? Well, it'll cost us 20% of world GDP by 2050. And just think how large the global economy will be there. The infrastructure changes needed will cost us less than 1% of world GDP, and the Downdraw project that's brought together all the potential solutions have showed that decarbonising in the most effective way possible, we could save $46 trillion because of all the win-wins that will occur. So if you hear those whispers, kill that myth now. So dealing with our environmental crisis will require governments, corporations and individuals all to work together. Governments need to regulate, enforce, tax, subsidise and most importantly, lead. So what should governments do? What is on my wish list of things that they should be thinking of? Support renewable energy, no brainer there. Tax fossil fuel use, cut fossil fuel investment and subsidies. Global subsidies over the last 10 years have averaged about $500 billion per year for us to have fossil fuels when we're trying to get rid of them. They can support walking, cycling, electric cars, public transport, and my favourite, trains. I just tweeted to actually say, just imagine if you had a US that had high-speed train network at bullet speed trains across the whole country. You wouldn't need to fly anywhere. Governments can also build low-carbon infrastructure and also, for this government, enforce building regulations. We can reforest, rewild our land. We can promote low-emission farming and plant-based diets. We can plan and adapt to a changing climate to protect the most vulnerable people in society. They could consider universal basic income and universal basic services, but that is a subject for another talk. I also get asked, what can we as individuals do? Because many of you, like myself, suffer from climate anxiety, the idea that we are powerless in the face of so much destruction of our beautiful planet. And I have the first rule is talk about it. Because I have seen the power of being able to talk about our anxiety and our crisis. I have seen and I've worked with billion-dollar companies that have gone from zero to hero in 5 years. Why? Because people talked about it around the coffee table or around the water cooler, and they said, we feel this is something our company should do. And they did. We can all switch to a more plant-based diet. We can switch to renewable energy. We can walk and cycle, use cars less, and fly a lot less, if at all. We can divest our pensions, if you're lucky enough to have one, from fossil fuels. If you happen to have investments or you can influence your company, then move your investments away from fossil fuels. You will thank me in the long run because guess what? Stranded assets will mean that they will be worthless in a couple of decades. Reject excessive consumption. Do we really need fast fashion? Do we really need all that stuff? One of the outcomes of the awful pandemic that we've been through is we all realized what mattered to us. Hugging our family and our friends, being able to talk to them, being social. That's what being human means. We're an ultra-social creature. We need this sort of collective. We need these interactions. We don't need an extra pair of trainers or 14 pairs of sort of like glasses or sunglasses to look really cool. What we need is friends, family. Consumer power is real, okay? Put your money where your ethics and your morals are and get other people to do so. Vote for politicians that care about our planet and its people. Protest. Glasgow was amazing. The power of people there was so vibrant. The diversity, including age, gender, ethnicity, social class, were all represented on the Friday strikes and then on the Saturday protests. There is a huge ground swelling around the world of people crying out for change because this is our planet. We have the scientists, we have the experts, we have the community groups, we have the justice leaders, we have indigenous peoples, we have the business leaders, we have the entrepreneurs to save our planet from ourselves, for ourselves. What we lack are politicians with a long-term vision and a commitment to make our planet safer, healthier, wealthier places for everyone, not just the few, the very rich few.
Thank you, Mark. And just a heads up, we're going to quiz you all before you're allowed to leave the room on some of those stats. I just wish I could pull some of them out of my brain as quickly as Mark does. Next up, we've got somebody who has managed to do a very rare thing of combining her passion for sustainability with her amazing skills and expertise in data, and created something really special. Please welcome Emma Kidley.
I'm going to start by sharing some pretty unique insights that I'm pretty confident that not many people know. There are incredible nuances to the way people buy laundry detergents. There are 4 types of detergents: powder, tablets, liquid and pods, right? Laundry powder buyers, well, they're pretty stubborn, they're stuck in their ways and it's really hard to convince them to change. Tablet buyers, well, they can be convinced to buy pods, but they don't really like buying liquid. And liquid buyers, well, they'll move to pods, they might move to capsules, but they definitely won't buy powder. And they've got an issue with slurping, but I don't have enough time to get into that. Overall, the brands that sell all these different formats, they actually want you to buy pods because that makes them the most money. Okay, there's probably 3 things you're thinking. 1, wow, this woman needs to get out more. It's true. Secondly, you're probably secretly now thinking about your own laundry habits and you're trying to spot the powder buyers amongst you. But overwhelmingly, you're wondering, what on earth has this got to do with climate solutions? But please stick with me, there is a point to it. I spent a massive chunk of my career working with data scientists, looking at people's shopping behaviours and working out how we can use data insights and behavioural science to nudge people out of these habitual behaviours and get them to buy more stuff. I'm not alone, you'll know that, right? There's loads of companies out there who are investing significantly in customer data, behavioural science, to put contents and offers in front of you to get you to buy more stuff. Last week was Black Friday. I had about 300 emails nudging me, go on, buy something, it's Black Friday. But imagine if all that investment and effort was put into getting people to buy less stuff, right? It's getting smarter. Why doesn't it help us to buy more sustainably and more ethically? After all, overconsumption is a key driver of the climate crisis. 40% of the emissions in the UK come from households. Research shows us that we all, or the majority of us, want to make a difference. And we recognise the need to drive to a net zero society. But knowingly or unknowingly, our values and our actions don't always align. And it's called, to behavioural sciences, a value-action gap. But this is where the power of data insights and behavioural science really comes into its own to help us plug this value-action gap and address climate actions by helping us to measure and understand and ultimately reduce our own personal carbon emissions. Okay, how do you measure your carbon footprint? If I'm thinking about losing weight after the pandemic, maybe an issue, I generally step on a pair of scales and then I run around, do a bit of exercise and I try and eat less and drink less and then I check back in on those scales and hopefully, fingers crossed, have made some progress. But how does that work when you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint? Well, our everyday spend very closely correlates with our carbon emissions. Every company we buy with and every product we buy, from our daily coffee to a new jumper to our energy bills, they all have an impact and have carbon emissions associated. By marrying up our everyday spend with the carbon emissions of the companies we're buying from, we can create a carbon footprint. Imagine if you can go into your bank account and you can look and you can see your carbon footprint along with your spend. Well, there are some forward-thinking banks out there who are starting to work with that, and my business helps them, Kogo helps them with that. I use an app, it's close to my heart, we make it. It gives me my everyday spend and it translates that into my carbon footprint. Okay, so last month my carbon footprint was 750 kgs of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Check that, got a measure, mic drop, boom. Okay, but the problem is we're not climate scientists, and to the majority of people it doesn't mean anything. To you and I, it's absolutely meaningless. And data is only powerful if it has context and you can understand it. So we find equivalence really helpful. 750 kgs is the equivalent of driving 2,000 miles in a petrol car or chopping down 12 trees. I worked on a piece of analysis for a bank a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at the collective carbon footprint of their customer base. And check this out, it was the equivalent of the emissions of Fiji, the whole country. You talk about us having a responsibility. It was a real wow moment. The other thing that we find is it's really important to get social comparisons, right? How do we stack up? How am I doing? So my 750 kgs is actually under the UK average, which is about a tonne a month. I'm feeling pretty good about that. But the big question is, what should it be? What should we be targeting? We're very privileged to work with Mike Berners-Lee, who's one of the leading carbon experts, and he says, for us to live a sustainable lifestyle, we should be at 180 kgs. Okay, so I'm not doing too well, but I need to work on it. But the reality is, in order for us as a society to make significant steps to this net zero target, we have to have this concept of carbon budgets ingrained in our everyday. We talk about 10,000 steps. We talk about the need to eat 5 a day in fruit and veg. We need to do the same with carbon. So measuring and understanding our carbon footprints is one part, and it's an important part. But unfortunately, it doesn't automatically lead us to taking action. I talked about this value action gap. The real challenge is you're trying to overcome some really ingrained habitual behaviours, from your daily commute to your diet. Remember those powder buyers I mentioned? They did have a point. It's a really good example of what behavioural scientists call status quo bias. You tend to stick with what you know, and you need a little nudge to get you out of these habits. But this is where all those proven behavioural science techniques that retailers have been spending so much money on can really help us to give the nudge out of our habits and get us to take climate action. I'm going to talk about a couple. I'm going to start with the idea of timely cues. So timely cues, we experience these every day, and I'll give you an example, right? You go into a fast food restaurant, let's hope you're buying a meat-free burger, and the first thing the person says to you is, would you like fries with that? You think, oh, that's helpful. And without thinking, maybe it's just me, but hopefully you do, I go, yeah, great, thanks. Well, that's a really good example of a cue or a nudge. We can apply this to taking climate action. When you get your monthly energy bill through, we've seen it's really powerful to give people a little cue to say, do you know, by switching to a renewable energy provider, you could reduce your energy emissions by 35%. It's even more powerful when you can translate that into personal consumption. But we also have the tools to anticipate people's buying behaviours. When you're browsing online for your new outfit for the Christmas party, isn't it great if you get a cue just saying, hey, listen, if you buy vintage rather than new, you could reduce your fashion footprint by 90%. Secondly, a really critical behavioural science technique is all around positive reinforcement and feedback. We see this playing out in social media channels, right? So the importance we all place on social capital, or some of us anyway, the number of followers we have, or the likes we get. We also see it playing out in the gaming industry. You get all these streaks, right? Well done, keep going, progress, keep motivated, engaged, actually maybe even a little addicted, but that's fine. We need to apply this to when we see people taking climate action. We talk about taking the train rather than plane. We should celebrate that, and we should recognise in my company, we actually give people an extra day's holiday when they take the train rather than go on a plane on holiday. After all, some of the changes that we might make can feel a bit like sacrifices, if we're honest. the convenience of the disposable coffee cup, or giving up those really succulent, juicy sausages. We've actually seen from our research that people are also really reticent to make any more climate actions until they get their existing climate actions recognised and reinforced. And we can all think about ways that we can reward and recognise these climate actions. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, does it really make a difference? Right? I'm vegan, I'm buying secondhand, I'm composting. Does it actually, I'm so small, my individuals are so small, and the climate crisis is massive. Does it make a difference? Well, it does. It makes a significant difference when you look at the collective. And there's a really interesting phenomenon that goes on that when we see other people taking action, we're more encouraged to take action ourselves. It's called the power of social norm. If you know your neighbours are voting, statistically you're more likely to vote. And if you know other people are paying tax on time, you're more likely to pay your tax on time. Look at things like veganuary and how catching and that is a momentum, and how contagious it can be when your friends and family say that they're going to take part in the challenge. I mentioned right at the start that I worked on a piece of analysis a couple of weeks ago for a bank. And I talked about this kind of powerful moment about the carbon emissions being the same as Fiji. But that wasn't actually the wow moment in the room. The wow moment was when we showed that by their customers taking a few actions, we could reduce carbon emissions by 600 million tonnes a year. That is the equivalent of planting 1 million trees. That is the power of the collective. And I'll finish up by saying that the TEDx audience have a much bigger audience than that bank. We all can play a role. The climate crisis, we have to make it personal. Because it's not some Hollywood film. No one's coming in to save us on this one. We have the opportunity as individuals to make an impact. And as a collective, an even more significant impact. So do me a favour, hop on the scales, go and find out your carbon footprint, take some actions, take all your family and friends, your work colleagues, your neighbours, everyone you can think, join. And let's really work towards making this 180 lifestyle the social norm. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emma. I'm definitely a fries with that kind of person too. That was absolutely fantastic. I feel a bit mind blown. Where do we go from there? Well, the next place we go to is a writer, a journalist who, if you've ever read anything about climate change in the papers in Britain, you've probably read her work. She's won countless awards and she's interviewed pretty much everyone you could possibly interview on the subject. Please welcome Fiona Harvey.
Thank you for that introduction. And yes, I've been writing about climate change since 2004, and I've been to almost every COP since then. COP's Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I've just come back from the most recent COP, COP26, which was in Glasgow, as you know. That's my 15th COP in 17 years. And really, it wasn't unusual in the response that it received. I came back from COP to find that pretty much everyone who had been there and everyone who'd observed the proceedings had decided that it was a failure. We were told in nearly every newspaper and every news bulletin, everywhere you looked, that COP26 had not set out to solve the planetary problem of climate change, that COP26 had failed in one way or another, or in the words of Greta Thunberg, that all that happened at COP26 was blah, blah, blah. So I've got a rather unfashionable view to present to you tonight. It's my view that COP26 was not a failure. In fact, it was a success. And not only was it a success, but actually those people who derided COP26 as a failure are not only mistaken, but actually dangerous, because what we need is a cold look at COP26 that sees where the successes were, what actually happened there, why we need to build on that to go forward. And in fact, if we don't see it as a success, then our chances of doing anything about climate change in the next crucial 10 years, in which, as we've already heard, we need to have global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees. If we don't see the successes at COP26, then we have no chance of reaching that. So what happened at COP26? Well, nations got together and there were, 120 world leaders, about 30,000 people in Glasgow, a bit more than that, taking part in the COP. And over the course of 2 weeks, these nearly 200 countries agreed to reduce greenhouse gases to something like, to quantities that would take us to roughly 2.4 degrees of heating above pre-industrial levels. That's according to the Climate Action Tracker. So that's a way off 1.5 degrees. But when you consider that going into COP26, when the UK took on the presidency of COP26, we were headed for more than 3 degrees of warming, then you can see that actually that's quite a substantial difference. Now, these don't sound like great quantities. You know, the difference between 1.5 degrees, 2.4 degrees doesn't sound like an awful lot. But when you consider that today we are only about 5 degrees warmer than we were in the last ice age, and that when the world was 5 degrees warmer than it is today, the poles were covered in swampy jungle, then you can see what a difference those apparently marginal differences in temperature make. So that's really worth having to bring down temperatures from something over, bring down the temperature estimate from something over 3 degrees to about 2.4. If all the promises that were made in Glasgow were met, we'd probably get to something like 1.8 degrees of warming, according to the International Energy Agency. Again, that's well over 1.5, but it's somewhere in the same ballpark. It's a heroic assumption to assume that all of the promises made in Glasgow will be kept, but still, it's taking us somewhere near to where we need to be. What else happened? Well, we got some agreement on a phase down of coal. Now, there was a great deal of debate about this, about what we should do on coal. And in the text that came out of Glasgow, instead of getting a reference to a phase out of coal, which is what most countries wanted, we got a phase down of coal instead. Now, this came about because China and India came along at the last minute in proceedings, literally as the gavel was about to be brought down on the agreement. They came along and said, we're not going to agree to a phase out of coal. This was portrayed as a show of strength by China and India, and a great show of weakness by the other countries, where the phase out of coal was watered down to a phase down instead. Actually, I think that's a wrong interpretation. I think we should see this instead as a show of weakness by China and India and a show of strength by the rest of the world. Because to go from a phase out to a phase down doesn't actually make all that much difference in practice. The point is that you've got a commitment in there to doing away with coal. It shows a very clear direction of travel. And let's consider what happened 10 years ago at a COP. In Durban in 2011, we were setting the scene for what became the Paris Agreement. And most countries in the world, the EU, the US, Japan, and most developing countries had formed a kind of loose coalition where they said that they would have a roadmap that would lead to more action on the climate. And that's what eventually became the Paris Agreement. That roadmap led to the Paris Agreement. But in that conference at Durban, there were 2 countries that held out, China and India. And they forced everyone to carry on negotiating late into the night on Friday night, late into Saturday night, and it seemed by the early hours of Sunday morning that China and India were going to win, that there would not be an agreement to create a roadmap to what eventually became the Paris Agreement. What happened there was that the EU stood up, said, no, we've got we've got the moral authority here, we've got these developing countries behind us, we can do something here, we're not going to let you win. And China and India actually backed down, and we did get the roadmap that led to Paris. So if you contrast that with what happened in Glasgow, where their great show of strength was to stand up and say, no, 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 you can't have a phase out, you can have a phase down. That's a completely different situation. And you can see how far things have progressed in that time, that those who tried to wreck agreement this time in Glasgow only managed to make a tiny change in one word, instead of being able to scupper the whole thing. So what that showed was the strength of the Paris Agreement, the strength of multilateral action on climate change. And think about this multilateral action. Look at the world around you. We're not seeing much multilateral action, are we? We're not seeing agreement on how to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. We're not seeing agreement on how to share vaccines. We're not seeing any kind of concerted international action on that. We're seeing different countries do different things, and we're seeing anti-vaccine people having a great deal of influence around the world. So we live in a very fragmented world. We're seeing China firing off missiles in the South China Sea. We're seeing the US and the UK and Australia making a defence pact. We're seeing a lack of concerted economic action as well in the wake of the pandemic. So we're not seeing multilateral action anywhere else on the globe. We are seeing it when it comes to the climate. And I think that's really important and something to be held on to. The point about seeing COP26 as a failure is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's dangerous to see it as a failure for several reasons. One is that politicians run away from something that's tainted by failure. So if you keep saying COP26 was a failure, then politicians won't want to have anything to do with this in future. And we've got to carry on. What we agreed at COP26 was that nations would come back next year at COP27 and take that 2.4 degree temperature rise and bring it closer to something like 1.5 degrees. So we need them to come back. We need the politicians to come back. Scaring them off by calling what happened in Glasgow a failure is not going to help with that. Calling it a failure also discourages people around the world. If people see this big international process, this massive meeting about climate change, and they think, oh, well, nothing happened there, it was all blah, 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 then they've got very little motivation to come back. It really is a very fine line between climate success and climate failure, between climate doomism and climate positivity. It's really easy to tip people over into despair if they don't see some kind of success, something to hope for. And the other thing that you open the door to if you see COP26 as a failure is you open the door to techno-lunacy. A few days after the COP26 result, there was a piece in the Financial Times by a very eminent observer who said, well, COP26 was a failure, so what we need to do now is we need to geoengineer the climate, because having conducted this massive uncontrolled experiment with the climate, obviously what we need to remedy that is another massive uncontrolled experiment with the climate. But there are plenty of techno-loons out there who will tell you that that is the case, and there's nothing to stop them, because they don't need an international agreement to start sending up planes and start seeding clouds, or to start sending out ships, or to build, sending out ships to seed the seas with different forms of iron or whatever other compounds they think that they can find that will change the climate, or to start putting up reflectors in space. They don't need our permission to do that. They can just form these billionaires clubs and put together enough money and do it themselves. So if we start to talk about the multilateral process around the world of the UN as a failure, then that's what we're opening the door to. And that's a very dangerous future, and I don't think that that's one that we should be encouraging. So before you join the bandwagon to call COP26 a failure, that's what I'd like to just draw your attention to, the fact that an awful lot was achieved there. Not enough, of course, not enough. An awful lot needs still to be done. But in the next year, there will be another crucial climate meeting, and the year after that, and the year after that still. And when we get to a few years down the line, we could be looking into the barrel of a Donald Trump presidency in the US. We need to have a lot of climate success under our belts before we face that prospect, because otherwise he could turn back whatever progress we have made if we haven't made enough before then. So as we face that, we need to build on the success of COP26, stop just taking this negative attitude of seeing it merely in terms of what it didn't achieve, and look forward to what we can all do. Because the UN process is the only process in which all countries of the world participate as equals, in which the smallest state threatened by inundation, if we've got over 1.5 degrees of warming, the smallest state has an equal say with the greatest, with the United States, with China, with India, with the UK, with Europe. And it's only when we have those small, vulnerable, poor countries sitting in the same room, eyeball to eyeball with the rich countries who are causing this problem. It's only when we do that that we actually achieve anything as a world. And that's what we need to keep doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and especially for the reminder that we need to normalise the solutions we want to achieve. I feel sort of cautiously optimistic after that, and also reminded of how important it is to work together on things. Now, from COP to Cornwall, our next speaker is coming in on video. He is probably the most famous gardener in the world, and has made a career out of finding, restoring and creating gardens, including the Eden Project. So I'll hand you over now to Sir Tim Smith.
Hello, I'm Tim Smith from the Eden Project in the wild west of Cornwall. If you were to ask me what my greatest hobbies in life are, there is really only one. I am a kisser of frogs. I love the idea of putting things back into good heart, places that hope has left, places where there is a pull on the land where fertility is dead. Here in front of me is soil, this most magical stuff. The 34 acres of what comprises the Eden Project were completely dead. I'd had this ambition to create life inside the bowl, the crater, if you like, of a volcano. Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost Worlds. I imagined that there would be this place that was rebuilt, full to burgeoning life, and in that burgeoning life we would offer hope. There is no advertising here, there is only growing, learning from the weft and weave of nature. It is absolutely extraordinary. We grow, this is the greatest collection anywhere in the world of plants economically useful to human beings. But that's just the start of it. People, men predominantly, talk about solutions to climate change. I'd rather not talk about the whole world, if you don't mind. I want to create a world which is here. Imagine, if you like Asterix the Gaul, that you're that little village on the front of the cover where all of Rome rules the France, except there's this tiny village. We are that tiny village for sustainability and the battle against climate change. We created soil. 90,000 tons of soil, the biggest contract ever made for the growing of soil. And we created life. We gathered all the plants together, we propagated them, we've grown them. We're now building a revolutionary a number of greenhouses at the back. And you know what is powering them? You know what's powering them? Is geothermal energy. 10 years ago, when everybody told us that we couldn't do it, we knew that we had to become carbon positive. By carbon positive, which is incredibly confusing because some people use carbon negative, what we mean is that we absorb a hell of a lot more carbon than we kick out. And what we're doing here is with beneath my feet, 5,387 meters down, a drill has opened up towards the core of the Earth, and the heat that we found there is 187 degrees centigrade, so hot that it can drive turbines, that it can give us enough energy to heat 34,000 homes around our edge and provide all the energy we need here at Eden. And with the solar arrays that are going up in our car parks, we will be so carbon positive that if we decided that only visitors from from Venus were allowed, they could all, 1.1 million, come from there. So we've got energy under control. We've got soil under control. We've manufactured it, we've enriched it with vegetative material, and you can just see the carbon absorption levels. At the moment, what we're doing with our degree group that is here is seeing whether we can measure every square inch of Eden to determine how much carbon can we absorb in the soil, how much fertility can we put in the soil, how much biomass can we grow in the soil, how much biodiversity can we encourage in the soil, as well as how much carbon can we sequestrate in that soil. Because the future is to do with what is called the circular economy. The circular economy, in case you're confused by that phrase, does not mean that everything is just recycled. You've got to take the bad stuff out. The journey for all of us who are interested in sustainability is actually not about doing less bad. That's why all this ESG stuff is so damned annoying. It's about doing good. It is an absolute. If you're saying to your children, we're going to do less bad for the next 20 years, well, gee, thanks, mum or dad. The future is about believing that you can create those circular economies, that you can create the society around you which is localized and muscular, that is energy rich so that everybody can afford to have it, that is food rich so that everybody can afford to have it. What this means is nothing less than a revolution. Most people keep talking about stuff as if we were consumers to be sold to. We are not consumers to be sold to. That is another person's story. The story we need to populate is that of the citizen. We are the active citizens. We belong together. We have purpose. We have meaning. We are rooted in this place. And there is no reason why we cannot have our education, our manufacturing, our lives as a whole, the poetry, the joy of a schooling system which is actually from day 2 to the day you die. And we can do that locally with systems change. As I speak to you right now, all over the world, people are gearing up. It's not yet in the newspapers, to 3D printing at a level you've never seen before. So actually all this supply chain nonsense will start to become produced where you are, using materials which can actually create stuff like carbon fiber from all the materials around you that rot and are then compressed with lignin. Everything is going to be local. All of that stuff which used to be called hippy-dippy is suddenly going to be muscular. It's going to be strong. And the only threat is that people who believe that power should just be in the center reject it. Because I believe that within 15 years of this day, you will be in a position where we will have city-states all around the country, all around Europe, all around Africa, all around the US of A and beyond, where people are taking their futures into their own hands. And philosophically, the reason why this is so powerful, so powerful, is that it means that we can see the territory over which we want to throw a protecting arm. Are you with me? It's to do with the only successful example of sustainable living anywhere in the world is on the island of Tikopia and in one particular tribe in the highlands of New Guinea. Why? Because everybody in that community knew all of their land and knew the impact that their actions would directly have on the land around them. That is why the fracturing of the nation state to lots and lots of federal areas of management is so exciting to me, because I think within the next 15 to 20 years, the change is going to be bigger than between the year 1910 and the year 1927. Just imagine what our children and our children's children are going to live through: a revolution in agriculture, a revolution in cleaning up our rivers and our ocean, a revolution in making our air cleaner, and we're going to create strong laws to make it treasonous to betray that. So, as you've listened to me with my rant for 10 minutes, based here at the Eden Project in Cornwall. We have an Eden Project now coming out of the ground in China. We've got one in Australia, we've got one in New Zealand, we've got one in Dubai. We are nurturing 2 wild sites, one in Aldabra in the Seychelles, one in Costa Rica in Central America. These places are beacons of hope. All we do is make friends and say, let's do this thing. Because actually, the most important thing of all is to let go. Humans are extraordinarily clever and generous people if you stop telling them what to do and create, if you like, a canvas on which to paint a new world where the future remains ours to make. Thank you for listening.
There we go. What an amazing step up of the energy and just at the right time. And I don't think it will surprise many people to know that Tim did that with no prep and in one take, which is like absolutely bloody astounding. What a man. And actually we're going from soil to soil with a speaker I'm really excited about, who is perhaps better known for her work as a model, but today has transformed her career and set up a charity doing amazing work in biodiversity and farming. And I'll hand you over now to Arizona Muse.
I have an invitation for all of you, and it's a really, really fun one. And I am someone who knows fun, because, as was said, I am a model. I grew up in the fashion industry, going to the most amazing parties and walking for some of the most famous catwalks, those whose brands' names you've definitely heard of. And I was in their ad campaigns too. But my invitation to you is to become an activist, like I am now, because I have so much fun doing this. And I know that's a surprise. I was surprised too when I realized how much fun I was having being a climate activist compared to being a model. I now spend more time talking to Business Green and The Guardian than I do Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. And I also spend more time going to climate conferences and lectures than I do photo shoots and runway shows. And my WhatsApp groups are now populated by activists and climate scientists who I am in awe of. It used to be celebrities whose names I knew and was watching on the screens as I was growing up. Tonight is the British Fashion Awards, but I'm not there because it's more fun to be here doing a TED Talk. My journey into activism began through the realization that I did not know enough about where these clothes came from, the ones that I was helping to sell. So I went on a deep dive journey to understand the fashion industry, the supply chain, which even though I was at the core of the industry, people like Karl Lagerfeld knew every detail that I'd ever told him about my children because he has an amazing memory. Rest in peace, Karl Lagerfeld. Where was I? Karl, thank you for interrupting me. Where was I? Remind me. Where was I? So, thank you. So I learned about this fashion supply chain, and what I learned was shocking. It's so negative, the impacts of the fashion industry. And nobody told me, even though I was buying these clothes, even though I was wearing these clothes and selling them, no one told me how damaging this industry was. I grew up thinking, oh, food is a problem, we need to sort out the food supply chain. But nobody mentioned that fashion is causing huge amounts of waste and extreme degradation to human beings as well. So let me take you through the journey of a dress. And don't worry if you don't wear dresses. This same story applies to the chairs that you're sitting on, and to the shoes that you wear, and to the cars that you drive in. We need to know where our stuff comes from. Let's take a cotton dress with some sequins on it. That cotton was grown in a field by farmers, but did I used to stop and say, thank you so much, farmers. Thank you for growing my dresses for me? No, I didn't, but I do now. They grew the cotton, then it had to be picked and transported for ginning, which is the process that takes all the burrs out of it. Then it has to be processed into a spun yarn so that it can be knitted or woven. Those two things will happen in different factories. Every time it transitions, it's wrapped in plastic and then unwrapped again when it arrives at the next place, which is often in a different country than the first place was. Why didn't anyone tell me this? Why isn't that written on the label when I buy something? I need to know that, and the people who made our clothes deserve that I know this so that I can help to protect them and their well-being through my choices when I spend my money. That dress has not even been cut up yet or sewn into anything. It will now go to the manufacturer. But before that, it'll get dyed, because cotton is usually white. Actually, it sometimes can be a mild shade of pink or green or brown, but we don't really like those shades, so we don't use them as they are. We prefer to bleach it or dye it into bright colors that weirdly make us feel happy. So then that garment is going to get cut up and it's going to get sewn by people who are surely being exploited, surely. And eventually a panel of it will get sent to India, because in India you can get the most beautiful and cheap embroidery, so the sequin part will happen there. And then it'll be wrapped in plastic again, and it'll be sent back to the manufacturer. And finally it will become a dress to be wrapped in plastic its last time before I buy it. I don't even want that dress anymore. I don't know about you. But that's not what I want to be wearing. It's not fair. And it's causing climate change. So that was the beginning of my activism and the learning journey, which, by the way, it took me years to learn that about the dress. So that is a bit of a shortcut that I've just given you. Everything that I was learning kept bringing me back to soil, the thing that we grow everything in. And I thought, like the dress, that it was one thing, soil. In 1 teaspoon of soil, there are trillions of microorganisms, trillions, and they're all alive. And they're doing stuff, they're eating and they're pooping, and they make soil when they poop, more soil. So we want them to be alive. But our conventional agricultural system is continuously spraying them with chemicals that kill them and make them sick and run off into water systems like rivers and lakes and eventually the sea and kill everything in there too. It's not a good story. So my mom, who's very wise, said, why don't you go and spend some time on biodynamic farms? So I started volunteering my time there, and it was every day was the most incredible day of my life. These farmers are so intelligent, wise. The way they see the land that they live on is just gorgeous, and I had never been able to witness that living in a city as I did in this fast-paced industry with people who spoke to each other in such quick ways and then moved on to something else. And it was just a different way of communicating that I encountered on these biodynamic farms. So my activism has led me to set up a charity to support biodynamic farming. But I've invited you to become activists, so you will find what you want to do with your activism. It may be setting up your own organization. It may be partnering with ones who already exist, who are already doing incredible work, who are already climate resilient. Find what you're passionate about and let it take you on the journey of your life, alongside everything and anything else that you're doing right now. Activism is not only activism. I am everything as well as being an activist. I am still a model. I am still a mother. I am still a citizen of this world. It's going to take me and be alongside me on my life's journey, and it will never end because it's so much fun. So I wanted to take you for a moment to begin your activism, if it hasn't begun already. Close your eyes. All of you, close your eyes. It is unanimously agreed among all Indigenous cultures, whose wisdom inform a lot of my activism now. That the single most important thing that we can ever do in the face of climate change is to build a relationship between ourselves and the earth that we live on. So focus on your consciousness, which is probably somewhere around your head, and begin to bring it down through your body, down to your chest, around your heart, and below to your pelvis, maybe to your feet. Whatever exit it is, bring your consciousness out through the edge of your body down into the earth, who is our mother, a living being, who is powerful and strong, and you know what? Loves us, even though we've been polluting her. Even though we've chosen to use models of domination rather than partnership, she still loves us. That is unconditional love. So throughout the rest of your lives, always find time to bring your consciousness down to the earth and build a loving relationship between your heart and the heart of the earth that we all share. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arizona. You can watch me be really clumsy with this again. It's always good viewing, isn't it? That was absolutely incredible, and I really love the idea of taking something you love and breaking it down and going further to the root and finding your way of doing your activism. I love it, absolutely love it. Our next speaker is someone who, I'm not going to define you by your age because I feel like everyone does that, but was the youngest ever person to stand in the European parliamentary elections. She advises climate NGOs, she advises charities, she advises corporates. She has been such a big presence at COP26. And she's also a creative director and utterly brilliant and a fantastic speaker. And the reason we wanted to put her last today is because she is the future. Please welcome the absolutely brilliant Daisy Gaji.
Oh God, now I'm scared. So, about me. As already said, I'm a youngster. I'm 21 years old. And I am part of Generation Z or Generation Z, whatever you would like to call it. We are the TikTok generation, but we also are the generation who's grown up in hard times. I have lived through recession. I have lived through now a pandemic. But ultimately, this is what has shaped the way that I see the world. And when I think about this question of how do we solve climate change, first I thought, I'm a little bit too young probably to have the answer, and I don't think I do. But secondly, I thought, climate change isn't the issue. The issue is toxic systems, and climate change is purely a byproduct of this. So through this, I started to think about the failures of this system, and this is something I have lived through. I grew up in North London, in Tottenham. Anyone from there? Gang, gang. But I didn't have a very glamorous lifestyle. I grew up in poverty. I grew up in a one-bedroom flat with my mum, my dad, and 2 brothers. This was my reality. I was a black woman who was living in London, living in the UK, facing racism, facing sexism, facing economic struggle, and I felt failure, system failure, very personally. And this experience of my life changed the way that I would see the world forever. So weirdly enough, my mum is really awesome. And I know everyone says that about their mum, but like my mum's actually really awesome. And when I was around, I would have said like 8, my mum decided, she didn't decide, she had a dream. Okay, she had a dream about owning a restaurant. And bearing in mind, we were living in poverty, living literally day to day. So the idea was totally bonkers. But my mum, when she's a woman on a mission, she's a woman on a mission. And she managed to make this happen. She brought, even with all of the systematic pressures on her life of being an immigrant, of being a black woman, but then also of having a very untraditional education, of having to leave school so she can provide for her family because her dad died. She took all of this and started her restaurant. And this moved us from literally living in poverty to being very middle class within a year. We were 1-bedroom house to literally 5 bedrooms. It was the craziest thing, having my own bed, let alone having my own room. But from this, I started to realize what a little bit of privilege can do. And the fact that this is a privilege, just to have the necessity to life, is a problem. But in that same breath, my mum said, what I didn't have, I'll give to you. And this is why she sent us to boarding school. Oh, yeah. My mum wanted us to have the best education that she couldn't have, but she also didn't want us to be horrible people. So she sent us to a slightly quirky boarding school. It was one of the first boarding schools to be attached to a grammar school, a public school, a state-run school. But then also, it was a boarding school that was very small, that acted like a family and had house parents like a family. And my house parent, Mrs. Nuttall, was fundamental in my journey towards doing the work that I do today. She was the first woman who came to the boarding house and saw the land that was around and said, we're going to put it to good use. And that's when she started the small vegetable garden. And this garden was a garden that I learnt to love the land. I learnt to love nature. I learnt about the relationship that we have with her, how she provides for us, but also we need to give back too. These were the fundamentals. And also we did have chickens, by the way. I still have a fascination for chickens, and we had a wormery, which was really awesome too. But through this like crazy experience of boarding school, I ended up loving the land. But then when I came to London back again when I was 16 to attend college, this is when it hit me. I started having breathing issues. And this was something that I experienced when I was younger, and they told me I'd grown out of. But it came back, and I asked the questions, why is this happening to me? And no one would give me the answer. And this is when, obviously, like every 16-year-old, I went onto Google, I typed in, why am I having these issues? And I found out about air pollution. And this was the punch to my gut that I felt like I was totally unsupported in and didn't expect to find. And I found out about air pollution and how in places in London it's over 6 times what's considered a legal limit. And then on top of that, it affects ethnic minorities and working class communities the most. And this is when I realised this isn't just an issue of air pollution. This is an issue of climate change, something that's the same thing globally, how it's affecting the people who haven't created the issue the most, are on the front lines without any support. So through this, I sprung into action. No, that's a lie. I didn't spring into action. And I feel like it's always very necessary to say that. I went through years of grief. I went through years of loss. I went through years of feeling disempowered in the biggest issue that could ever face my life. And there was a moment in university where I was like really chronically depressed, struggling with eco-anxiety and stuck in one of those like really sad student flats. And this is where my friend, she told me about this protest group. She said, it reminds me of what my parents talked about in the 70s. And I was like, what are they called? She went, oh, Extinction Rebellion. And I went, okay. So this is where I was highly skeptical. And she was talking about how we need to go to this meeting so we can find out what's more about them. And I was like, yeah, let's go to this meeting, right? What have I got to do apart from sulking my room and think about not doing my essays? So I did go. And that meeting was the meeting that changed my life forever. That meeting was the meeting that, one, I found community and kindness, which was the craziest part, because I didn't ever have a moment of where people actually asked me, how was I, and meant to hear an answer that was honest and accurate, and were prepared to hold me in my feelings of grief and loss. But then ultimately, I found agency. I found vast wealth of knowledge. And I realised that this is the work that I need to do. This is the work that connects to my gut and the feeling of being connected to the earth. But alongside my crazy activism of where I ran for election, did lots of grassroots stuff, I won't go into too much detail, but then also, started suing the government and all sorts, I realised I was studying history and fun history, but there was a really core part of history that I ended up loving and ended up bedding the work that I do today, which was finding out how we got into this mess. So I always say we have to deal with things holistically. We have to deal with it from the roots. And in this country, the roots are in the enclosure. The enclosures was a thing that happened in the medieval period. It was the theft of common land from the average person. And this created the cycle of abuse that has led to the climate crisis. From the theft of land from common people, right round to how they were forced into wage labour in order to survive. But then this was the creation of the beast of capitalism, the beast that wants to continuously be fed and grow and grow and grow, which led to needing more land, more people, more resources, which began colonialism, which weirdly enough is partly why I'm here. From someone who's come from the diaspora, I recognise the trauma of the history that we've had and how the only way we can address this is really from the roots. And this is where it led me in my weird journey of activism to a thing called regenerative cultures. It's very cool. It's cultures with an S because there's multiple of them. And this is something that was coined by David Christian Wall, but it was created by Indigenous people, by people like my own family's land, the Igbo people, the Anyoma people from the Niger Delta. It's a way of living of where we build healthy and resilient communities in order to live life, to not even just live through life, to thrive through life together. It's something that is based on deep learning, deep healing and resistance. And in the activist culture that I found my feet in, we broke it down to 5 main pillars. The first one being self-care. It's not about face masks on Sundays. It's not about getting in the bath, even though I wish that was a core part of it as well. But it's about the inner work we have to do on ourselves. We have to acknowledge we have been brought up in a toxic system, a system that has taught us how to use and abuse one another. And what we need to do is purge ourselves of this and re-socialise ourselves into better. It's about how we can communicate with not just one another, but our communities at large. It's that community care of really loving for the people around you, but then also not even just geographically and locationally around you, but people across the world, people who we share the same homes with. And then we go into action care, which is like the sexy part for activists. And it's the part of where, how do we take care of one another in moments of intense pressure, in moments that feel like it is life and death? How do we say, I'm going to take care of each other and be here for one another? And finally, how do we take the same energy of love, duty and care right back to our earth? The earth is our mother, is a great healer, great lover, someone who provides for us even when we don't quite deserve it. But also, she has rage. And this rage is coming. This rage is what we see as climate change. And without solving these issues from the roots, we cannot address her rage. We cannot hear her. This is why when we think about solving climate change, it's not about carbon. It's not about those crazy statistics. It's about how do we stop these failing systems to continue to create the problem we see today. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Days. Thank you so much, Days. And what a brilliant way of bringing together an evening that has focused on community and kindness and agency and gentle optimism. Our speakers tonight have been amazing. Thank you, Alice Bell, Ed Gillespie, Tamsin Omand, Catherine Howarth, Matt Britton, Farhana Yamin, Mark Maslin, Emma Kisby, Fiona Harvey, Sir Tim Smith, Arizona Muse, and Daisy Gaji. That was amazing.